Thank you, Nora, for having me. I think it's a really good time to be talking about this question, isn't it? From movements to revolution, how can we smash capitalism? Because, there's been a lot of rising up and movements that we've seen over the last few years, even happening right now, from what's going on in Cuba to the massive demonstrations we saw about Palestine, the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, the climate strikes. There's another one called for the 20th of September, the abortion fights in Poland, kill the bill here, reclaim the streets. The list goes on, actually. And there's an incredible amount of anger at the system as well. And this often causes people and movements to rise up. I mean, even if you think about the anger here in the UK, with so-called Freedom Day just this Monday, when COVID cases are on the rise, England is the first country in the world to lift COVID restrictions whilst having mounting cases. I think a lot of us can agree it's really worrying. A lot of people are still vulnerable. Our death toll is one of the worst in the world. We remember when Boris Johnson said, let the bodies pile high in their thousands. And that's exactly what they did, from Matt Hancock being absolutely useless. Sajid Javid, I don't have much trust in him either. We're waiting to hear about a pay rise for NHS and health workers, which probably we know is not going to be enough and what they deserve. Killer cops on the streets, and genuinely the mishandling of the pandemic globally, the rampant inequality, poor access to vaccines in the global south. And that is just the COVID crisis in the pandemic. And I'm sure you guys like me are already pretty pissed off at the world when you list just that result. But there's a myriad of other reasons for people to be angry at capitalism and want to overthrow it. And I mention this anger and the movements we've seen over the last couple of years because sometimes, and particularly now actually, mainstream politics can feel flat and quite stagnant. I haven't seen the most recent polls, but a couple of weeks ago, the Tories were miles ahead, despite revelations made by Cummings beforehand. And of course, what's just come out recently, in some ways, ironically, Dominic Cummings is actually playing a better job at the leader of the opposition than Keir Starmer is in some ways. Starmer's doing a terrible job. Just this week, as we've seen with Freedom Day and scientists and so on criticising Boris Johnson, what does Keir Starmer choose to do? He chooses to purge the left within his own party and the Labour Party rather than fight Johnson. And I remind people that this is actually just mainstream politics, isn't it? And that's why I've mentioned at the start the impressive results that we've seen. I want to focus a little bit as well, a bit on the Palestine demonstrations that we saw. We saw 180,000 people in London protest for Palestine a couple months ago. This has rocked the Israeli government's plans and tore it into shreds what they want to do in Palestine. And hopefully the resistance continues. But of course, as well, the Black Lives Matter movement has opened up big questions in society about the police, the curriculum, also the Reclaim the Street system, the resistance against G7. We've got Reclaim Pride this weekend, which is a really amazing protest about, taking back pride as a protest. And, the point that I'm trying to make here really is that politics and struggle on the ground, the struggle of ordinary working class people, doesn't actually reflect the stagnation of politics in the House of Commons, which is the politics of above. And this is what we care about as socialists, really, isn't it? What's happening in the street, on the ground, in our communities, the attitudes of normal working class people, and not what the conversations which are happening in the boardrooms and behind closed doors, because we know as socialists and revolutionaries, that's not how we win change. It's not how we smash capitalism ultimately. And most of the movements we've seen over the years are about demanding justice and equality, an end to racism, imperialism, homophobia, and so on. And that's also what we want as socialists. We know that we can only get socialism from below, from working class people taking power from themselves. And we also know this is how we win the world free of oppression. So whilst Black Lives Matter and so on does great work in shifting narratives around racism, we will never be able to make that shift from movement to revolution and smash capitalism until we link arms with workers all across the world and not just fight against racism, but all forms of oppression and exploitation. Because this is what Marx saw, didn't he? He saw that it was workers who have the power to change things in society via withholding their labor and hitting the bosses and the oppressor where it hurts, which is their pockets and their bank accounts. And I think this is why we focus on movements to revolutions and struggles in the street. streets. And to get that real shift in society, which we want to see, the smashing of capitalism, we need a complete turning of the tables. And we've also had glimpses of things like this in recent years as well, from Egypt in 2011 to Sudan in 2019. We need these struggles to go from a movement to a revolution. And I think this is really what the meeting's about, isn't it? That's the interesting point. How do you make that shift from movement to revolution? And really, what makes a revolution? So whilst overthrowing the system, well, what we mean by revolution is overthrowing the system, giving workers control and true democracy. And we think that we need a working class revolution in order to get there. So if people don't mind, I want to go through a little bit about Lenin and what we say is socialists in the SWP and what we mean about revolution. Because we know that movements spring up often spontaneously. People fight on all sorts of issues. But what makes moments revolutionary and how we as activists can seize the time and transform the society and smash capitalism is the question we really want to answer. So, like I've already said, what we mean by a revolution is a fundamental changing of society, where the forces of power are flipped, a complete uprooting of the normal social structures and a genuine transformation of society. And an example like this, I think, may lead some people to think of an event like the French Revolution, for example. But actually, as socialists, that's not what we would call a socialist revolution. This was a bourgeois revolution. Yes, there was a change in power, but was it actually an emancipatory act of the working class? Was it them that changed society in their own image and gained workers' control in the end? It wasn't really. You know, in the clear aftermath, it became clear that the slogan liberté, égalité, and fraternité was not really bestowed on all men and women equally. So as Marxists, we mean something much more fundamental. A socialist revolution is first and foremost a vast expansion of democracy. Socialism is about the transfer of economic power away from a tiny, greedy elite and into the democratic control of the majority of the working class. Revolutions are about the mass entry of ordinary people into the political stage as they actively attempt to shape their own futures. Millions upon millions of people, including many who may have never been to a protest before or even voted in an election, will take to the streets, take over their workplaces, and start debating about how society should really be organized. And in this process of revolution, we think that new institutions are created in order to express this new democratic power of the masses, elected councils of workplace delegates who decide the way forward for the revolution. And if you look throughout history, actually, in many socialist revolutions, these structures appear again and again, each time under a different name. In the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, they were called the Soviets. In Germany in 1918 to 23, they were called, I can never pronounce this right, I think it's the Rata, but someone might want to correct me in that. And of course, in Chile from 72 to 73, they were known as the Cordones. And these erectings of structures and Soviets and so on was one of the first reasons why Marx thought we needed a revolution in order to smash capitalism, because we have to uproot the structures of the capitalist state. Unlike the French Revolution, we can't just simply take over the existing structures and try and recreate them in a more equal image, because we understand as Marxists that it's these very institutional structures that create the exploitation and the oppression that we see today, which is why we need workers to build an entirely new world. But Marx also thought that we needed revolution for a second reason, to make these movements shift to revolution. And this was actually to transform ourselves. Ideas change in struggle. All sections of society, Marx thought, could rid themselves of the muck of ages and the oppressions that are created by the capitalist ruling class in order to divide workers by creating councils in this way and having a socialist revolution. From sexism, racism, transphobia, and so on, we can start to free ourselves from the shackles of capitalism. And this is what Lenin meant when he said that revolutions are festivals of the oppressed, and that actually as socialists, we should be tribunes of the oppressed and fight on every single issue and question of oppression. So I think from this, we can see how despite inspiring current movements and uprisings that I mentioned at the start, despite the ones that we're experiencing, we're not actually facing a revolutionary moment in this instant. So the next question we have to ask is, what makes a movement revolutionary and how can we get there? Well, I think first, what makes a movement revolutionary? So Lenin said that a revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. But not every revolutionary situation leads to a revolution. I know there's a lot of revolutions in that sentence. But what he meant by that is that either movements can fail to spread to broader sections of society, strikes can be isolated, defeated quickly, or the state can clamp down on protests, like we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement in America, or at the police vigils in Clapham Common, or the Israeli state when they bombed Gaza. But Lenin saw that there were actually two conditions that need to exist for a revolutionary situation, and thus for a revolution to even be possible in the first instance. First, the first condition is that he sees the ruling class can't rule in the old way. Often in times of deep crisis, whether that be economic, war, polarization, or actually the epidemic and the crisis that we're facing now, usually the ruling class have reliance on things like mass media, traditional institutions like unis, the church, and the police in order to maintain their control. But in times of crisis, these things can begin to become unstable. And when they can't rely on anti-union laws or the assumption that people will willingly accept state racism and ultimately capitalism, the ruling class at the top of society becomes weak, unstable, and messy. And the second condition that Lenin saw to make a moment revolutionary is that he saw the masses cannot also go on being ruled in the same way. This can either be in response to the new repression suffered at the hands of the ruling class, the effects of the crisis they may be experiencing, and glimpses of what actual genuine workers' power could look like in the Paris Commune and so on, in forms of collective action, demonstrations, strikes. And I think here it's quite important to address the question when we're talking about from movements to revolution and how we can make one. I think we need to address the question of violence, don't we? Because this is something that always gets thrown up against us as socialists, the possibility of bloodshed and a violent revolution. But actually, this is a false assumption that a revolution is somewhat a mob violently seizing power. Actually, we've already addressed this. A revolution is not a small mob, but is actually about millions of people collectively rising up. And let's be clear, actually, as socialists, we're not pacifists. We believe in our right to self-defend against the state. However, in every revolutionary situation, the violence always comes from the old order. It comes from the state as it desperately uses every weapon it has to try and cling on to power. If we look back through history, it was the Tsar who ordered the army to shoot at protesters on Bloody Sunday in 1905, the US who ordered a hit on Castro. The violence is clearest, actually, in the military coup that removed Chile's Salvador Allende in 1973, that resulted in the deaths of thousands of socialists and trade unionists. So what we can see from this is that there will always be a fight back from the ruling class in times of movements and revolution. They're never simply going to hand over the keys to the state and their arsenal. And this is why, as Lenin noted, that whilst these conditions may exist for a revolutionary situation, by no means do these conditions have any bearings on the contingency or the success of the revolution. For us to be successful, we need to be as equally organized as the state that we're up against. And this organization has to come in the form of a vanguard party. Whilst it's not the vanguard that necessarily leads the revolution, this is done by forces much larger than a revolutionary party. It is necessary to have this layer of cadre and activists and workplaces, unions, universities to raise the arguments about revolution, capitalism, and a socialist society that we can win. And this is what Lenin saw when he wrote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary practice." We need this understanding of capitalism, the forces that can change things in society, i.e. the working class, and the necessary organization we need in order to get there and ultimately smash capitalism, which is what this meeting is about. So how do we get there? What is our role? What is our role as those of us in the meeting and people who are listening who want to resist the system we live under and win? What's the role of members of a revolutionary party or to those around us on the left? To quote someone who isn't Lenin now, another great revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg said, "Those who do not move do not notice their chains." And it can seem obvious to us as socialists, but what does that actually mean in practice? Well, once people become involved in resisting state of repression, involved in the movements that we've seen, they can begin to see how deep that repression really goes. From Black Lives Matter, there were questions about the American police. Then the UK, seeing that we weren't innocent. We saw Boris Johnson line up with Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, after she was, faced with so many charges and, mishandlings of various situations. We see the state does everything to try and maintain the same order. Similarly with Starmer, when he dismissed the Black Lives Matter as a moment and called it a moment rather than a movement. He shunned the people who tore down the Colston statue in Bristol. And as we're involved in these movements, we begin to see a whole network, the same people with racist views and the same, Tories who are slashing benefits, not giving teachers and nurses a pay rise, a whole network of people who have power in society that want to maintain the status quo. And of course, every revolution starts with being involved in these movements and fighting for the reforms in the here and now, which is what we have to focus on as socialists. In 1917, it was peace, bread and land. Today is climate action, sanctions on Israel, addressing matters of racism. These are the questions that get people involved in movements in society and radicalize them. And of course, as revolutionaries, we throw ourselves into every activity that's happening nationally and locally. But we also understand that we need to go to forces that go far beyond us, talking to colleagues, friends, and family. Now we can go back with our friends. You can see why it's sort of useful to have a copy of Socialist World Corps on you all the time, to be able to talk to people and say, look at this strike that's going on, but also, what the Israelis are doing in Palestine, because, it's about building on the issues and arguments that ordinary people face every day and linking it to a system that fundamentally has to change, and that's capitalism. And we want to encourage everybody to get up and move, in the words of Rosa Luxemburg. This is one of the best things we can do as revolutionaries. But we also want to be involved in building these mass movements at their very heart, whether that be protests on campus, resisting the COP26 meeting that's coming up, the climate strikes, and so on. It's important to have this sort of internationalist attitude towards these movements as well, and caring about what's going on in other countries, because whilst we may recognize that the real enemy is at home in the British state, we also know that the revolution and ultimately smashing capitalism relies on its permanency and its ability to spread across the waters. We want to see an end to borders. I think it's quite pressing to talk about this right now after they've just passed nationality and the asylum bill that's been put through by Priti Patel and the Tories, which makes it illegal to save a drowning refugee in the sea. We actually want to see a breakdown of borders, every refugee welcome. Marx says that the working man has no nation. So again, once as socialists and people who want to see the smash of capitalism, we have to have an internationalism in things that we do. And lastly, I think one of the important things in trying to make a movement revolutionary is the importance of building united fronts in the face of racism and fascism. The rise of such vile racist movements only strengthens the power of the capitalist ruling class, which is why a militant united front comprised of socialists, trade unionists, etc., is how we fight this front. Unlike liberals and those on the sort of centrist left like Paul Mason, who claim that we need a popular front working with progressive capitalism and centrist politics, we know that that's not what you can do. I mean, just look about the arguments in racism in football at the moment about taking the knee and the horrible onslaught that 3 of the Black English players faced. The state and so on, it was their racism at the start and criticizing them taking the knee that emboldened racists and allowed them to sort of feel that confident enough to throw racist remarks at these people. So of course we can't line up with the state and the establishment when we're trying to fight bigots like Tommy Robinson or Priti Patel and racism in that way. So it's our role as revolutionaries to make the movements that we're currently experiencing, those that I talked about at the start, as broad and as radical as possible. Like I said in the beginning, the anger at the system and within society is already there. people are looking for radical alternatives. You know, it can feel like a while ago now, but the popularity of Jeremy Corbyn, Sanders, Podemos, and so on shows that actually people really do want an alternative to capitalism. And actually, we know as revolutionaries the limits of reformism. It will never give us the world we want to see. And quite frankly, due to the climate crisis, we don't have time.
Sorry, you've had 20 minutes.
Okay, no worries. I'm coming to my sum up. But yeah, we know actually, quite frankly, we don't have time to wait to vote in toffs in Parliament and so on, and wait for them to actually pull their socks up and do something. We have to address the climate crisis right now, which I think is important. That's what we've talked about and why we speak about revolution, the ability to make revolution movements, make that shift, the radical shift that you need a political party, because we know it's the only way that we are going to ultimately overthrow capitalism and build the society that we want to see. And actually, the ruling class are scared of the genuine power that revolution can have. And that should make revolution all the more attractive to us as socialists. So just to finish with, I was looking through quotes for this meeting, and there was one that made me smile. It's probably a bit brash and so on, but I thought it was quite fitting, given that this meeting is about how we can smash capitalism and get rid of the 1%. It's from a great anti-racist revolutionary, CLR James. And he said, "The rich are only defeated when running for their lives." So with that, I'd like to encourage people to build the movements on the ground, raise the arguments for socialism, and we should definitely make the bastards at the top do some running for once. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me, everyone. Thanks, everyone. That actually turned out to be a really fruitful discussion. There's loads actually to come back on. So I'll try to be brief and cover everything I can. I guess firstly, on Wendy's point at the very beginning about lockdown and relating to this movement, I mean, you are right, it is certainly a really broad movement with a layer of people there. I mean, just from my own experience, on the same day as the People's Assembly, there was also Trans Pride in London. And unbeknownst to us, we got there early to set up, and it turned out to be the same place that the anti-lockdowners were assembling, which was where Trans Pride was. So it was interesting for me and the 3 comrades who were there early whilst thousands of anti-lockdown protesters were arriving. And I was actually sort of caught between 2 crossroads on how to relate to them. There are a lot of young women on the demo who came up to the stall and really agreed with us about what we said about Trans Pride. We sold our pamphlets and our literature to them. And there was also a layer of sort of younger men who, you know, we're going around screaming really transphobic, homophobic things as we walk past. And it shows you, you know, that actually this movement is definitely broad and very uneven. I mean, I think it's the importance really when it comes to the far right being involved in it. This is where our work around Stand Up to Racism is key, isn't it? And us challenging racism within society, you know, in some ways is likened to how we approach the question of Scottish independence. You know, there's layers of people within the independence movement who call for it along patriotic nationalistic lines. We say, no, we want Scottish independence, but we need to unite, you know, under one banner, which our comrades are doing in Scotland, and opposing racism. I think in a similar way, you have to intervene in these movements. Yes, we're angry at Boris Johnson, we're angry at the government, albeit we're angry at them for sometimes different reasons. Like personally, I've had my first jab, I'm not anti-vax or anything. But I guess, again, it comes down to the role about ideas, where they come from in society. A lot of the people in the anti-lockdown protests believe in these conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are scapegoats, alternative explanations to a system that the ruling class relies on, you know, and it's about where ideas come from in society. Marx said that the ruling ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling class. It's no wonder that a lot of these people have these sort of ideas within society. And of course, as socialists and revolutionaries, we have to challenge those ideas. We know that class consciousness is uneven. Not everybody is won to the question of revolution, or even the fact that capitalism is the problem. And this is why we have to act as revolutionaries in our workplaces, on stalls, to have these conversations. I wouldn't necessarily advocate going into those movements themselves. And I think it links to what Caroline's question was, you know, what is missing in these movements? And it is this lack of class consciousness, this level of unity. And this is something that the party can do, that the party can bring to movements, to bring the theory and the revolutionary practice that goes along with it. And I think what Hugh was saying about our position and being a bit slow, I mean, I think our position's been kind of right. You know, throughout lockdown and so on, we have criticised Boris Johnson, put the fight against the Tories, but also raised the question of the need for safety, and so on. And I think that was quite the right thing to do. I think and on Catherine's point about fascism, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Kevin, I don't know if I think you answered it quite right, but I do somewhat, not necessarily disagree, but I don't think fascism only becomes a possibility when a revolution fails. It is when there is a void and a vacuum that a revolutionary party fails to actually fill. Like, of course, in Germany, you had the failed revolution in 1919 to 23, but fascism didn't really take power till the 1930s, late 1920s. And that was because the left was not united. They didn't have Trotsky's theory of the united front. So I think actually fascism becomes a very real possibility and a risk when capitalism is in crisis and economic despair. And it's when there isn't the answer with a loud enough voice of the working class that people can be drawn to the right. But of course, we are right that it is a tool that the ruling class fall back on. It's a middle class movement, which the ruling class will get in bed with. You know, Trotsky, when he was talking about fascism, he said that society is sort of like a pyramid, and there's a ball at the top on a knife edge. The ruling class want the ball to stay at the top. The socialists want it to roll down and smash the back of capitalism. The fascists want it to roll down the other side and smash the back of the working class. And I think that is when fascism becomes a real possibility. And actually, it's quite worrying nowadays. If you think about the middle classes, the self-employed, the small business owners, these are the people who have been really hardest hit. The people who didn't get any furlough, who haven't been able to run their business. They're the people who are angry at the Tories and the top of society. And a lot of them are the people who stormed the Capitol in the US, and a lot of them are the people who are on these anti-lockdown marches. And that's something I think we should be wary about. And you're right about the need, though, of course, for a revolutionary party. I always get the quote wrong. I was trying to find it on my phone, but I'm sure Trotsky said somewhere, like, if it wasn't for the Bolsheviks, or if it wasn't for 1905, then fascism would have been a Russian word, or something like that. But it's about, the crisis within society. But I think, that's also why we say never again, isn't it? A lot of people say, oh, fascism, that's over and done with. We've dealt with that. The sort of Fukuyama, like, end of history, capitalism and neoliberalism's won out. We're never idle as socialists. We're always ready. We know the threat of the far right and the racists. And that's why we say the slogan never again, because it could happen again. And it's up to us to fight against it. Coming on to the question about, how revolutions coming all at once and internationalism, I think it's been answered quite well. But of course, we want the revolution to spread. It won't necessarily happen simultaneously, but how does it spread? Well, if you think about in Russia and Germany, of course, Russian troops were fighting on the front lines with German soldiers in 1917. Once the word about what's going on back in their hometown in Petrograd and so on gets back to them, they put down their guns and they say, well, fuck this, there's a revolution going on in my own country, I'm going to go back there. And then the German soldiers were left on the front line, were like, oh, well, maybe, we should go back and maybe say something about the revolution that's going on in Russia. Things spread in that way. And of course, it's not necessarily going to be successful as we've spoken about, but of course it won't happen in one country because you're still under the pressure of the global markets, sanctions and so on. And, that's why actually the internet as well makes it much easier for us to do these things. And the ruling class is scared of the power the internet has. I mean, in Egypt, the regime shut off Twitter for a number of days because of the spread of the revolution. Tim mentioned the farmers' strike in India. When they were going on hunger strike in Delhi, Modi turned off the internet so that they couldn't get their message out. This is the threat that people rising up actually face. And in terms of what we do in trying to spread it, of course, the real enemy is at home. But that's why we have an international socialist tendency, isn't it? Other parties in Australia, South Korea, Greece, so on, that we link up with as the SWP, sister organizations, because we know that we fight on a coordinated basis, but we may be reacting to very different struggles on our home ground. Just on what Raf was saying about what happens to movements. You're right, the Kill the Bill protest has died down. And this is what happens when you don't have a united force or a united strategy behind a movement. You know, this so-called sort of horizontal organization is actually a really big lie that people tell you in movements. When a movement is allegedly horizontal and everyone can pitch in and has equal say, that's not how it happens. You need a sense of structure and organization and hierarchy, actually, because when you have horizontal organization, what it means is that you just have a few individuals behind closed doors calling the shots. But also one of the problems of movements like that is that, you know, they do want to involve everyone. Someone was talking about getting the Lib Dems involved in the climate movement and so on. Of course, as revolutionaries, we want the mass of the working class to be involved. But I will not be on a protest with Boris Johnson, bankers, CEOs, and so on. They are not part of the same movement that we are. And I think just in my final point, we have the same analysis when it comes to the Revolutionary Party and the need for it. You know, unlike the Labour Party, we are not a broad church in the SWP. I'm proud to say that you cannot be a Zionist and a member of the SWP. You can if you're a member of Labour, because that's what they try and do. That's what social democratic parties try to do, try to represent the entire class. Unlike us, as revolutionary and Bolshevik parties, we say, like Lenin said, we aim for the SWP, just like the Bolsheviks, to be, well, obviously we want it to be as big as possible, but we know that it will be small but strong, made up of the most militant sections of the working class who are prepared to fight on every single issue. And I think, you know, this is something that we have to do. We don't kind of, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Yeah, I can't read them. I was scribbling them. But I think that's what we're trying to say, isn't it? Is that we don't compromise in the SWP. And that's the need for a revolutionary party and that sort of structure to be able to be involved with them. So just to finish with, really, I don't know if there's any people who aren't members of the SWP here today, but I'd urge you to join. Not only do we need a party for all of the reasons that we've spoken about here today, about the level of uneven consciousness in the working class, and so on. There's a link in the chat which you can click on, but also we need a party to represent minorities and so on. And I can't guarantee you much, actually, joining the SWP. I can't guarantee you a revolution tomorrow in our lifetimes. Like we said, I can't guarantee you that it will be successful. But what I can guarantee you is that we will never compromise or sell out on the issues that we care about. Unlike Sir Keir Starmer, who does sell out, you know, this is what they try and do. They try and represent the entire class, don't they? We don't try and do that or speak for the class in that sense. Yeah, unlike the leaders of the Labour Party, we will never compromise on what we believe. We will always fight for Palestine, fight for trans rights, fight for climate justice, and so on. And we need to be bigger in order to actually smash capitalism. So yeah, if you've agreed with what we've said today and you want to get involved, I'd encourage everyone to join. Thanks for having me.